Okay, let's get to it. And I'm going to introduce our host for this afternoon, who is that wonderful voice from CBC Radio 1's The Sunday Edition, Michael Enright.
Thank you. Welcome. Good to have you here, and I'm glad the rain has held off, although it may happen while we're discussing Jonathan Lethem's book. Jonathan Lethem has been described as a verbal performance artist. His work has been called edgy, funky, paranoid, and my favorite, as a writer of seductively vertiginous prose. I might ask him what that means. His latest novel, Dissident Gardens, has received rave reviews and is a bestseller. The novel tracks the lives of 3 generations of American leftists and centers on the matriarchal communist Rose Zimmer, as Jonathan Lethem describes her as a hammer of personality. In addition to being wildly funny, Dissident Gardens is also a tour through the dark maze of radical protest politics, beginning with the dangerous days of McCarthyism in the 50s, right up to the Occupy movement of today. And without giving anything away, it has the funniest opening sentence I have ever read. Jonathan Lethem was born in 1964. He grew up in a racially mixed neighborhood in Brooklyn. He studied painting at the Manhattan High School of Music and Art. He briefly attended Bennington College, but he left before getting his degree. He points out that the only occupation he has ever followed, aside from writing, is working in antiquarian bookstores. His novel, Fortress of Solitude, became a New York Times bestseller in 2003. His 1999 book, Motherless, Brooklyn, won a National Book Critics Circle Award. And in 2005, he was awarded a MacArthur Fellowship, the so-called Genius Granite. And this year, he is a judge of the Giller Prize. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jonathan Lethem. Lethem!
Thank you. Thanks.
Do people always boot your name the way I just did?
It happens a lot. There's like a war between the Lethem and the Lethem people, and I.
Lethem sounds lethal, so I'll keep that. Before we talk about the novel, you are a judge of the Giller Prize this year. Can you take the pulse of CanLit at the moment? How are we doing? How is Canadian fiction?
There's a lot to be excited about. I always hesitate to think that there's any collective voice. It never seems to me that everyone's, agreed. Oh, we'll write this sort of novel now, and then you get this sort of collective effort. But there are trends. There's a lot of amazing undercurrents of crime fiction in the best. The best of the novels this year. I think the ones that a lot of the ones that I found exciting were, there was some quality of the policier or a noir inside the form.
That's funny because we're supposed to be a peaceable kingdom.
Yeah.
We don't carry guns or shoot them.
But it's also just great. I don't know. It's beautiful to see the representational nature of Canadian writing. There's so many for an American juror of this award. I'm actually really immersed in. I become easily familiar with essentially either Montreal or Toronto culture, but to really see how defined and articulated the identities are in other provinces and the Newfoundland writers and it's really I think it's very much like its nation. It's really a place where identity is being navigated and negotiated in the present. Mm-hmm. And there's no the outcome of Canadian identity isn't foreclosed. It's still sort of up for grabs.
We're always looking for our identity. And the best definition I've ever heard is that We are as Canadian as possible under the circumstances. I want to talk about growing up in Brooklyn. That is you, not
yeah.
I. I went to school in upstate New York for a while, and there was a kid in my class from Brooklyn. And I said to him one day, John, where are you from? And he said, Brooklyn, what of it?
Yeah.
Now, what is it about where you grew up?
Yeah. By the time of my generation, what of it had turned into, what are you looking at? Yeah, it is sort of a defiant identity. I think I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what it meant to be from this place. And I mean, the weird thing is it's become a kind of a brand, a hipster brand recently. And I think it's very confusing for people who only knew the place in earlier generations, where it was basically a place to get away from. I mean, Brooklyn was sort of where you landed as an immigrant, and then you tried to transform yourself into an American. It was a laboratory for new American identities, and you tried to vault into the larger, into Manhattan. You tried to go across the bridge. You tried to graduate basically from this cauldron, this immigrant cauldron. But when I came of age, New York City was at a particular crisis point. It was the 70s, and the whole place was kind of it was like a dystopia. It was a fallen city.
Ford to city, drop dead.
Yeah,
That was the
yeah, exactly. Yeah. The city was trying not to drop dead.
Yeah.
And so getting out of Brooklyn was even more urgent, and I think it had become get out of New York City while you can. Yeah. So the fact that it's this destination now, that everyone wants to be there, it's like permanently disconcerting. But I guess by writing about the gentrification of that neighborhood in some way, under my watch, it changed, and I ended up sort of documenting the before and after of Brooklyn as a place where you design your exit strategy versus Brooklyn as a kind of place for lifestyle reinvention.
Dissident Gardens. Who lives there? Who are the inhabitants?
Okay, well, so Dissident Gardens is a play on a real neighborhood in Queens called Sunnyside Gardens that I knew growing up because my grandmother lived close to it, didn't live in it. And it was a charged concept because when my mother was a young girl and she and my grandmother were living alone and my mother was growing up, they briefly lived in Sunnyside Gardens and then left. It was known as a kind of leftist utopian precinct. It was meant to be, in a lot of people's vision, a place where people could live in a kind of different form of urban community. And the blocks, the architecture of the neighborhood specifically reflected this. It was, and Lewis Mumford was involved in this design. There were blocks around shared urban gardens that were not fenced. And so people, would open their back doors and be in a space that belonged to everyone.
What was it politically? Was it a hotbed of Jewish radicalism?
It was that exactly. And I don't think that when it was first designed, it was designed by what you might say, kind of left-leaning American idealists. But it quickly became a destination for a kind of hotter version of left radicalism. And there were a lot of, sworn revolutionaries who went, still had to live and work and be part of New York City, and so that was where they went to live. So there were a lot of members of American communist parties who were living in that neighborhood, and it was a joke in the surrounding neighborhoods that Sunnyside Gardens was sort of like a red, it was an outpost of the Soviet Union for a while.
Were you a red diaper baby, or your mother and your grandmother?
I guess you'd call me like a paisley diaper baby. My mother could have claimed to be a red diaper baby, although having written this book where I seem to be describing my grandmother's or someone like my grandmother's political affiliations in great detail, I actually had to make it all up. I don't know, and I don't have any way of knowing because I don't have her dossier or anything. whether my grandmother was ever in a cell, for instance, or whether she was just so sympathetic that she felt hung out to dry by the Khrushchev revelations. And what I do know about my grandmother is that she had a very intense, kind of charged and very dark political life that preceded my time of knowing her, and that there was something about the 1950s that my Uncle Fred could taunt her about, and she would just smolder and get more and more silent.
Miriam says of her mother that she contained within her a volcano of death. What does that mean?
Well, the character Rose is
Zimmer,
very morbidly fixated on the horrors of the 20th century. I mean, outstandingly, of course, the Holocaust. And she takes it very personally. And I think, for someone of her persuasion politically, but also tribally Jewish, but not in Europe, there was something for this character that was almost like a giant trick had been played on her. Not only did they take away the ground she stood on politically, but then she's renounced her Jewish religious identity. Then suddenly to be Jewish becomes a kind of solidarity that she's been denied because she's renounced it. And she herself is not a camp survivor, but all these camp survivors come and live in Queens, and she feels they have this giant tragic claim that she identifies with but isn't her own. So for her, she's just, she's wearing all of the 20th century disasters are worn on the sleeve for her.
When you were talking about Rose and Miriam, and by extension your mother and grandmother, and you told somebody once that we are all injustice collectors. Mm-hmm. Was that them?
Rose is certainly an injustice collector. She's
standing around waiting to be offended or
affronted.
Yeah,
well, right. Looking for external evidence to mark our sense of inchoate, permanent indignation. What that's happening out there can justify how angry I feel. That's an injustice collector. So something comes along and you're like, there you go. That's what I mean. Yeah.
You grew up you said you grew up in a family of protesters.
Yeah.
It was during Vietnam. Mm-hmm. Your parents were artists. Did you go out to protest?
Oh, yeah, I was marching all the time.
When you were 6 years old, you
carried
a sign?
It was a way of life. I mean, the first years I remember, I was born in 1964. I remember the 60s just barely. I remember some events like the moon landing that I can confirm. That was 1969. But so the first protests were the kind of the archetypal 60s ones. I grew up marching against the Vietnam War, and I don't know how many times I was doing that, but I'm sure it was more than I could remember, and before I can remember. Then as the causes changed into the 70s, we were still an activist family, and we would seize any occasion to be part of a movement. It was how we identified. Mm-hmm. It was like our family's form of commitment. So I was marching in New York City for daycare centers. That was a big movement in the early 70s. I was marching in the Helen Caldecott era, again and again against nuclear proliferation, and also specifically against nuclear power plants like Shoreham. And I mean, I meet people now, and we bond over the fact that we were at the exact, we can identify these marches that we were at.
The way your grandmother undoubtedly would have marched for the Rosenbergs.
Yes, for the Rosenbergs, and in her life, and one of the instigating items in my family history for my starting this book and inventing Rose was that my grandmother had been photographed in 1938, and the photograph had been run in a feature in Life magazine, marching against a brown shirt celebration of Hitler's birthday in Manhattan. And it had turned into a kind of a shouting match and a bit of, there was a bit of a scuffle.
Just the Bund, the German-American Bund?
Yeah. A couple of noses were bloodied, and she's there in the middle of this with actually holding an American flag. But she was what they would now, where at one point they would taunt communists for having been premature anti-fascists. So she was a premature anti-fascist.
There seems to be a strain in the book or a theme, I guess. The women seem stronger than the men.
Yeah. Aren't they often stronger?
Well, yes, but there's Lenny, the goofy chess-playing I don't know what the hell. He's a weak guy. He's trying to
Yeah.
sell the Mets an anthem, but the women are very strong,
Well,
politically and socially.
yeah,
or
they're at it. Oh, well, I think that I see this, and I certainly saw this in both my grandmother's and mother's lives, but in the generations that they also represent. And these characters, I think, absorb a lot of images, from women I've met or books I've read, people like Vivian Gornick, who, in that era when the idea of radical liberation of various kinds was being invented, whether it was a utopian socialist vision or in the 60s, and they were nevertheless subject to the vast disadvantages, the kind of material fact of a sexist society. And so at one level, they were driven crazy by the paradox of so much freedom being described and so many, the joke about this would be all those hippie chicks who were still expected to do their boyfriend's laundry, right? It was like everybody was free except you still clean the house and I don't. But I think at a lot of levels, it made the women angry about something that was hard to identify or describe, but it made them strong, and it made them fierce. It made them people who did run the world. You see this also in like Doris Lessing's novels about socialism in Britain as well.
You said you come from a political heritage tradition, going back to your grandmother, and your parents were protesters, and yet you told somebody once that you said, "I identify with a political life without successfully living one."
Yeah. Well,
what happened?
I could be very glib and say, because I protested so much before I ever even gave it a second thought, it's like I put my time in. Someone else has to do it.
You paid your dues.
Yeah. But I think it is more nuanced than that, and sometimes there are parts of the story that I guess I do feel remorseful about. I tend to see the costs of commitment so powerfully, and this book is about that in many ways, that I marshal my forces for I guess what I would call more intimate causes. I protect my family and my friends, and I tend, when I do commit to something, I tend to make it quite local. I fight a particular development in Brooklyn that I think is a disaster for the community. Right now, I am, for what it's worth, I'm involved in trying to keep a beautiful old library from being razed for what seems to me a very short-sighted maneuver on the part of the library system. But do I have the kind of comprehensive, are my larger utopian wishes, my sentiment that this world could be a better one than I've, than the one I've been born into, are those things really activated or in any larger framework? I think I'm probably pretty limited on that level.
Jewish leftist radicalism, in the 30s it was the formation of unions, in the 40s it was attacking fascism, 50s civil rights.
Yeah.
Is there an active Jewish leftist radicalism today?
That's a really hard question. I mean, I'm sure there are people who identify themselves as being part of one who would have some forthright answer for you. If there is, I'm not. It's not something I can identify or inhabit or point to. I mean, one of the tricks is that this book is a great deal more Jewish than I am. I had to actually, just as I had to, my father grew up in the Midwest, and his background is a sort of fuzzy Protestant, heartland, and he then
red state.
He does come from a red state background in the U.S. And in fact, all of my my network of cousins and uncles and aunts on that side of the family, he was an outlier. He became a painter and moved to New York and married a Jew, and they were hippies. And so he's really a black sheep in that family.
Traitor to his class, is he, in a way?
Well, but it just doesn't feel like he's a traitor. It just feels like he's a fascinating, outlier. I mean, and it's a very loving family, I should say. But that's to say, I grew up with a multiple series of available backgrounds and identities. And he was going to Quaker meetings, and I was taken along to Quaker meetings when I was a kid. I did quite a lot more of that than I ever did visiting any Jewish religious rituals, because I came from secular Jews. And so my identities were a muddle, and I've only been able to identify how deep my Jewish roots are by inference and exploring them deliberately, and I have done in order to think about the stuff that went into this book, but it doesn't come natively.
You were born, as you said, the year after John Kennedy was killed. Did you research the 50s? Did you go back and, I don't know, read newspaper clippings or books, or how did you? Because the atmosphere of the 50s that you capture in the book is true, it's real.
Thank you. Well, I was very, very trepidatious about doing the historical novel. It's not something that I trust, and I'd never really done anything that would qualify that way before, but I realized I'd put myself in the position of having to recreate these atmospheres. I didn't look at it in terms of, newspaper clippings or great events. And I mean, I think, in fact, I was terrified of doing what you might call like Forrest Gump history, where it's all assassinations, and those things never happen in this book. The characters just don't happen to be as struck by those things as they are by things that are a little more in their intimate political sphere. But the reading I did tended to be novels written by left-leaning people of those various generations.
For example?
Oh gosh, there's so many. There's Tess Schlesinger's what's it called, the Dispossessed, and Irwin Shaw's the Angry Heir. There are a lot of books that are not necessarily widely read anymore, but that mattered to me in this project. And some of them are they too much reflect grievances or old things, current events that people don't think about anymore. But I wanted to know what it felt like for those writers at the time and draw on that and pull that energy into the book. I read a lot of good memoirs for this book too. I mentioned Vivian Gornick already. Fantastic book called Fierce Attachments about her communist mother. But also, not even always political things, but Philip Lopate's accounts of growing up in Jewish immigrant leftist Brooklyn, and Anatole Broyard has this marvelous short memoir called Kafka Was the Rage, just about what it was to be an intellectual and a kind of a bohemian in the early Greenwich Village, late 40s, early 50s.
But that was the sad thing about your grandmother. She was an intellectual woman whose central core belief she couldn't sustain.
Well, I came to see her in terms of, these vast, God absconded, or was discredited for her over and over again. Her own intellectual, secularism robs her of her legacy as a Jew, and she just is forced essentially by what she sees as a kind of common sense that she can't avoid, to announce to her father at the dinner table one night that she doesn't believe. And so then she's still defined, I think, by that kind of tradition. And so socialism becomes another god. And then that is destroyed for her. And this betrayal is so bewildering because she sees life in these epic terms. And so she makes New York City, in a way, into the next, the myth of the greatness of her identity as a immigrant New Yorker, and the melting pot, and Fiorello LaGuardia, the great image of New York City as this, secular utopian metropolis becomes her next god, in a sense.
So you're growing up in New York in this cauldron of politics and resentments and anger and all kinds of things. At age 15, you decide that you want to write what you call hippie science fiction. And then you found out you didn't want to do that, or you weren't good at it, or what happened?
Well,
first of all, what is hippie science fiction?
I don't even know what I necessarily meant by that. I mean, the things I was reading, what I liked were all kinds of marginal cultural things. I identified with everything except what I thought was the mainstream or the center or the hegemonic culture.
Because you thought you were on the margin?
I felt that and I felt excited about it. It wasn't like a defensive reaction. I felt this is where the action is. My family is, we're political outsiders trying to transform the center, and my father was a painter, but he wasn't a famous one, and his work contained a lot of both a lot of challenging political content, and it was very it came out of a lot of his reading. He was painting Native American imagery, even though he wasn't a Native American, and the books on our shelves were, the Beats, and my mother was into Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov, and she was
Philip Dick?
Well, yeah, no, I found him on my own. She was didn't happen to have Philip K. Dick's novels in the house, but that was the next thing I latched onto. And to me, all of this stuff seemed to have an energy and a vitality, and I guess in a way, a dissident potential. It challenged the status quo. That's what it all had in common. And so I identified with anything that seemed, and that also went into loving pop cultural forms, comic books and genre film, film noir and the Western. I thought this stuff is, it has a charge. In a way, it interrogates the status quo.
Would you be offended if I suggested you were a Bob Dylan obsessive?
No, yeah, I am. Yeah.
Because it's in a lot of your work, your essays. You did profiles in Rolling Stone. What is it about Dylan?
Well, I mean, first of all, it is a legacy thing as well. He was part of my family's cultural life. The records were there, and I grew up listening to them. And there was also lore. My mother had been part of the folk scene and she'd hung out with Phil Oakes and Dave Van Ronk and a bunch of others, and she'd once been out, for a night in a group with Dylan. So
this is in the village?
Yeah. It felt really personal to me and like something that I could claim and be excited about in a way that was individual. But yeah, his voice really speaks to me, and I think that the iconoclastic character of it, the way he sweeps up images of exile and disenfranchisement and dissidence into his vision of what it is to be an American singer or an American artist is very, very easy for me to identify with.
You wrote a profile in Rolling Stone of James Brown.
Yeah.
And you did something very weird. I've never seen this before. Every time you refer to him as James Brown. You never call him Brown or James. So the name James Brown becomes a kind of title rather than a name. Was that deliberate?
I was trying to get into the piece this sense that when I was in his presence and also among his entourage, his band, and the people managing him, and the people just ushering him from place to place, that he was like an alien life form that had landed and was to be treated, in every sense, every condition around him was unique, and he needed to be indulged and gratified and spoken of in certain ways, and that it's like he never touched down. Other people take off their celebrity disguises. His had melted into his body completely. And it was as though I was, writing a profile of Bugs Bunny, and there was the real Bugs Bunny.
Yeah.
And so what would you ever
and
call
you never
him?
refer to
You would
Bunny.
never say anything except Bugs Bunny. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly, right. I want to get a sense of, I guess, tradecraft. You listen to music while you write.
Yeah, yeah. Sometimes in a very purposeful way. I have music that seems to me to anchor some of the emotions of a story that I'm writing or a novel, and I go to it as a touchstone. And
It doesn't distract you?
No.
It doesn't.
But so I always have something on. Sometimes it's what I was about to say. Sometimes it's not purposeful at all. I just put my whole iTunes on random and just. But I think I have a horror of silence. I don't want to hear the howling of my own, the whine of my own vacuum brain while I'm writing. So it's like I have to fill that space with some stuff.
Do you use a computer?
Yeah, I do now. I wrote my first 3 novels on a typewriter.
Yeah.
I still think that in a way I learned to write on a typewriter, and that was quite important for my process.
Do you make charts and graphs and notes and?
Barely at all. I mean, I'll jot a few notes when very specific phrases or plans occur to me that somehow seem like I might lose them, that they could be forgotten because maybe they're intended for something that I know I won't get to write until a year or 2 years into the project. So I'll write a little note just to keep it. But other than that, I prefer the sense of holding the story in my head and improvising and feeling my way through it without apparatus.
One of your fellow judges, Margaret Atwood, has been called a genre bender, as have you. The hell does that mean?
Well, I've spent so much time thinking about how I really feel about this question, and it's changed a lot for me. My first couple of books made really deliberate and very playful, excitable, fun, passionate gestures towards
To go across lines.
obvious genres. My first novel is both a hard-boiled detective novel, and a dystopian science fiction novel. And people compared it to Blade Runner, and I think there were some other examples of people kind of colliding noir and science fiction. And I thought, yes, I'm one of those, and that's great. I wanted to do that. And the book wears it on its sleeve. It announces this. In subsequent books, my engagement with the genre has become much less deliberate and I think, in a way, more interesting to me because my interest in those things and my affection for those things has become just part of the toolkit. Something I can reach for, and it'll affect one layer of the book or one part of the book, but it doesn't provide such a strong, dominant, kind of exoskeleton. And I think that's even more interesting. I feel, and I always insistent on this, there are lots of genres that people don't, we all know the ones that have a kind of a part of the library or a part of the bookstore that booksellers or publishers refer to. There's maybe 5 or 6 of those, right? Horror, romance, and so forth, and Western. And often these things are seen as very déclassé. But there are also, in a real sense, there are lots of genres that people don't identify as readily, that aren't as
for instance,
inscribed in. Well, another one, and I've written one of these, is the academic satire, which I believe follows a very, very specific kind of, it's as tight a form as the Western is, or to change the framework, as like a sonnet is, or a kabuki theater. You have to do, there always has to be the department meeting, and there always has to be the Christmas party where everyone drinks too much and, kind of becomes unbuttoned for a while. And when I wrote mine, I was very conscious of it being
Was the plagiarism?
No, my academic satire was a novel called As She Climbed Across the Table.
Okay.
My third novel. And when I wrote it, I felt I was as much in the grip of a deep genre with deep properties as I was when I was participating, for instance, in writing a detective story or a science fiction novel. That it may not have a section in the bookstore, but from a compositional perspective, it was as ironclad an idea to be working within.
Is part of the idea, though, to dislocate or discomfort the reader? At one point you said, I think, discomfort is part of my master plan.
Yeah, that sounds very aggressive and fun, right? But I think, if anything, hearing you put it that way, I think that, undermining expectations or dislocating or disorienting the reader is easy to valorize, easy to overstate how important that is. But another thing you're doing, and genres are one of the best ways for doing this, is you're working with expectations and familiarity and and comfort. You're making people recognize things that they respond to, but you want to make sure you do that in a way that is fresh and that amplifies their experience rather than shutting down, numbing their, oh, I get it, this is just going to do this, I've seen this before. But you want them to be in a vibrant relationship between the familiar and the unfamiliar. If you only dislocate people, you're not really offering very much.
Okay, I'm comfortable reading the novel and the character, identifying with the characters and what's happening. And then toward the end, Rose, this hammer of personality, has an affair with Archie Bunker that totally derails my expectations.
Yeah.
Now, and it was hilarious, but it was weird.
Yeah. Well, it was a strange avenue for the book to go into, and yet I think that, well, for one thing, every writer, I think, in my generation has to contend with the power of, certain other mediums, and probably overwhelmingly television, the way it colonizes experience and the way people absorb so much of it and identify with it so powerfully. But also, Rose is of a generation susceptible to it in a different way, because when she begins her life, there is no television. So it comes in.
Yeah.
And for her as a character, I mean, I mentioned the way she super identifies with certain figures of power and authority, Fiorello LaGuardia, and before him, Abraham Lincoln, and before him, Marx or Stalin, that she, for someone who's very into egalitarianism, she's also got a weird thing about men in uniform or male charisma, male authority. And Archie Bunker is kind of cop. She has a big affair with a street cop, with a lieutenant on the Queens police force. And Archie Bunker, when her life is unraveling and her political life is unraveling and her ability to relate to other real human beings is I mean, she's also just suffering a catastrophe of old age and dementia at that point. She sort of goes into the television, and who is dominating her world at that time? Well, the master of Queens in the middle of the 70s is Archie Bunker. That's his place.
The king.
He's the king. And so she starts to identify with Archie Bunker as like the most degraded in her sequence of male totemic figures.
Just before we go to the audience, I was curious at the end, and given what's happened in the last months or so, how would Miriam and Rose respond to what's going on in Washington? Let me put it another way. When did your country go crazy?
It's a very handy paraphrase of your whole question there at the end, because I think writing this book, one of the things I came to feel is that, in a sense, it never went crazy. It was founded crazy. That one of the to take it for a moment to the book, and then I'll expand it to maybe encompass, if I can, the first part of your question. One of the paradoxes, I mean, I didn't set out to write historiography, and it's really a book about the characters for me, but I did have to absorb a lot of information and impressions about the political realities of the 20th century, and specifically for left movements, and specifically for actual avowed American communists, which seemed like such an antithetical role for an American to want to overthrow America. And these were revolutionaries, right? And yet in many ways, they made real contributions. They experienced in their attempt a deep participation in the society. They became civil rights activists. They created unions. They founded neighborhoods. They dealt with the problems of life, because that's what you do. Whatever your ideology is, you actually are embedded in life, not in ideology. And I started to see that the irony for me about being an American communist was that they were much more American than they knew. And in some senses, they would claim this. There was actually a slogan, which I have one of them airing out in the book, that was a real slogan, that communism is 20th century Americanism. That the ideals that they were avowing were actually a reconnection with the revolutionary origins of the country. And I think I kind of believe it in a way. Obviously, their attempts were, they were in disgrace by the end of McCarthyism. The hammer blow of McCarthyism and the American anti-communist movement on one side, and the humiliations of the Khrushchev revelations about how the Soviet Union was insupportable image. You couldn't be idealistic about the Soviet Union anymore. But I still think that the truth of their lives is that they were participants, and in some ways quite typical participants, in American political culture, because we are a country made up, for better and worse, of waves of crazy utopian wishfulness, the dream of living in a world other than the one that we are situated in. And that's how the United States became a place. It's obviously how all sorts of different movements announce themselves, and they boom out into the space, often making some westward migration to go say, we'll do it over here, and California becomes this utopian precinct. And I think, putting aside right and left, you can look at phenomena even as consternating or seemingly nihilistic as the Tea Party, as another thing that is encompassed in this description, that we have a propensity for organizing our experience as Americans in terms of wanting to tear it apart and make it something completely other than what it is.
But in all of those reformations, and I agree with you, there's always been, to my mind, at the core of that, there's been the central idea of A, a written constitution, and B, a government that can insert itself when needed into the lives of people. When I look at the Republican Party, or I should say the Tea Party, which used to be the Republican Party, they hate the government.
Yeah.
They hate the government. I mean, people hated Roosevelt, and they hated Hoover, and Eisenhower was a communist, and all that kind of thing. But the sense was the government is there, and it's going to stay there. But these people, I don't know.
It is. It's deeply crazy, but it's identifiable, I think, on certain terms. It's like the toxin of some of the very same things that define the United States positively, or define some of its positive accomplishments. This sort of wild, this mania for self-reliance and self-reinvention and for frontiers of various kinds becomes also, I think, it curdles into these anti-government nightmares, really.
I think Dissident Gardens is a very good primer on what's happening today.
Thank you.
And I thank you for writing it.
Thank you.
Jonathan Lethem. There's a microphone right there in the center aisle. If we have any questions for Mr. Lethem or any comments.
It doesn't all have to be heavy political stuff either. I know that was all pretty, and
I got one. How long did it take you to write it?
Well, it was 5 years in the making. I started this book immediately upon finishing a previous novel called Chronic City. And I wrote about 150 pages of it on bluff. I had an image, and I had a desire. I had this emotional connection to the characters, but I couldn't make their world persuasive yet. So I wrote this fragment, and then I looked at it, and I realized I have to learn so many things that I've never known before, and I stopped cold and basically spent about 2 years reading. And
did you throw out the original?
Thinking about the book. No, those chapters ended up in transformed, in a new form. They ended up being incorporated into the book, though they're not the opening of the book. But I had to just abide with this project and all of the areas of ignorance and just figure it out. And it was also a matter of thinking, for me, not just about historical facts, but how the book was to be structured. It's structured in an unusual way, and I needed to really look at it for a long time and say, it seems to want to work this way, but why? I needed to know why I was doing what I was doing.
Yes, ma'am, at the microphone.
Hi. I actually have 3 related questions.
Great.
I hope that's okay. So the first one is, I don't know if you've heard about, there's a local Toronto professor who's been sort of in the news lately because he didn't feel that there were any female authors that were worth teaching. And I wanted to know what you thought and if you had any female authors that you would recommend.
Yeah.
And third...
Hang on, we'll get to the...
Okay, we'll stop there.
Okay. This sessional professor at U of T said that I only teach heterosexual guys.
Yes, I saw this. Well,
Don't like Chinese or women writers.
Yes.
Chinese.
Yeah. Well,
Saw you nodding, so I
what
figured you.
a dumb thing to say. I mean, it doesn't seem to me a particularly. I mean, I don't want to presume that I know what kind of day he was having or what kind of person he is. But I will say that it seemed to me he was turning something that could have been very simple into a big problem for himself and for anyone who overheard him, and it turned out to be everyone, right? Which is that, I mean, professors can make a syllabus of what they like and feel they know how to teach. You know, I'm teaching a course right now, actually on the Western. So I'm teaching Mark Twain and a Thomas Berger novel, and I'm teaching Patrick DeWitt, who wrote such a marvelous book. Sisters Brothers. And a bunch of other things. And at the beginning of this course, and I mean it as a sincere apology, but also an opportunity or a framework for the thinking in the course, I say, okay, folks, look at my syllabus. It's all these guys, and we're stuck with that. The Western is made of this, you know. And I mean, I try to play against that in certain ways, and I assign, there's an Annie Proulx story, and, there are ways to cut against it, but there's no way with the material of my particular syllabus to pretend. And because it's also a problem within the books themselves. The characters are all men, and when women appear, they're almost only prostitutes. It's just disastrous, right? So, but on the other hand, at other times, I have a syllabus where what I'm teaching, it gives me other opportunities.
Willa Cather, you could do.
I could do Willa Cather.
Yeah.
But no, let me keep going. Just to say, I'm very happy to say, of course, that in a moment like this, I have a number of female authors who loom enormously large for me. And I mentioned a couple in passing. Doris Lessing, I grew up reading her, and I've gone back to her again and again. Very, very important writer for me. Iris Murdoch is a very important writer for me. These are in fundamental kind of baseline ways. They influence what I do. For instance, there's a section of this novel that's done in letters. And the idea of putting letters, unexpectedly having them erupt, a sequence of letters between two characters in a novel that's not otherwise an epistolary novel, I totally took from Iris Murdoch. She was the one who showed me how powerful that could be to suddenly hear the voice of the characters talking to one another.
You had another question.
Yeah, so in addition, Gilmore is up for Giller, which you are going to be judging. Does it have any influence? And if it doesn't, how are you able to separate those two
I
things?
think you're about to breach the sanctity of judicial independence.
Fair enough. I thought I just asked.
Well, I'll say very simply because it's the case.
Yeah.
So there's no reason to be dodgy about it. He was put on the long list before this controversy erupted.
Right.
But I will be myself judging books, not authors or things I imagine
exactly.
I know about authors.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you, ma'am. Yes, sir, behind you.
Oh, okay. Hey, I really like all the characters in your books, especially their names, from Lionel Ezrog to Mingus Rood to Chasen Stedman. And I don't think I've met anyone with names such as those. Maybe a Chasen, a Lionel, but never Ezrog or Rood.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering, how much time do you spend thinking of your characters' names, and whether is this a process that you go through as you're writing a novel or right before you embark on one?
Yeah, well, thank you for for saying you like them.
Sergius Gorgon.
Sergius Gogin, yeah. I like to, I mean, for me, it comes from a couple of things. One is, when I was growing up as a reader, you know, everything I do as a writer really comes from something that I loved or responded to or identified with as a reader, and often the formative stuff happened really when I was young. I used to notice that I would always have trouble remembering characters' names, and even in books I loved very much and had just read, unless they were unusual, unless they had some kind of strange action or energy in the name, and then it would stick. So I thought, I'm going to give that same favor to my readers that those writers have given to me. And the writers I associate with this are like Dickens and Thomas Pynchon does it. And, but also, you know, people do it who you don't think of as doing that, but like Henry James gives all of his characters very meaningful, sort of loaded, gnomic names that that stick in your head because they're so odd and not really like normal names. And it seems to me this is it's part of the language of the book. So if you just pick a very neutral name, if you name people, Bob Jones just to make it seem more typical, well, you've taken a place where the language could have been charged and you've made it boring. So I just want all the language to be charged.
If I say Milo Minderbinder, you can see the character.
Absolutely, yeah.
You can see him right away.
Yeah. And I do need to have the characters' names before I believe in them. So I work on that really hard at the outset when I'm kind of creating the constellation of characters to go into the book.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Any other questions? Well, on behalf of you, there we are.
Yeah.
Got to pull the mic down a little bit. Okay.
Your heartbreaking James Brown article. When he died,
Yeah.
had you anticipated the way the family would act?
Well, yeah, I don't think I spent any time consciously trying to project what a mess it would be. Yeah. But it wouldn't have taken much. It wouldn't have been a hard leap to make because his family is not centered. There's so many children from different women and different wives, and he had made so many fortunes and lost them, and so his legacy almost dictated this kind of result. I can't say it was at all surprising, but I hadn't spent any time thinking about it. Even though I met him and spent time with him in what turned out to be so near the end of his life, the dynamism, and he was visibly aged in certain ways, but the dynamism, I thought he would live forever. I did not think I was hanging out with someone who would be dead 6 or 8 months later. It was like, Bugs Bunny doesn't die. It just, yeah. I wasn't thinking he was on death's door at all. He was still just so, in a way, he was one of the more intimidatingly energetic and even, I would say, kind of youthful human beings I've ever been in the presence of. There was like something about him that was still like a crazy 12-year-old or something.
Thank you,
Ever
ma'am.
backstage with him just before he went on?
Yeah, I did. I actually was. There was a moment when his band, they all wear these uniforms together. They're no longer called the JBs. His current version of the band was called the Soul Generals. I thought of them as the JBs, but I was so with them on the way out of the stage, and that kind of what you think of as, because they made such good fun of it, of the Spinal Tap moment, like getting from the back to the front. And I was with the Soul Generals charging out to the stage that I got into the last minute group hug, heads bowed prayer, and I was like there with them before they all went on. And then I ended up standing, the guy who puts James Brown's cape on? I was actually standing in the wrong place and he had to move me to get the cape. So, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
It's kind of a trade craft question as well. You listed some of the books that you read in order to get ready to write this.
Yeah.
One book that I thought would have been hard for you to avoid, but you might very well want to avoid, was E.L. Doctorow's Book of Daniel.
I love that book, and it
Yeah,
was a signal book for me in this.
And I wonder
project,
whether, how you have to work, kind of almost against it in a sense, because what he's done, you're not going to want to do again. And so how did you deal with the fact that that book existed, I guess?
Well, I guess I always have like a very much a proactive engagement with the idea of influence. I always think, go toward it instead of being afraid of it. Engulf and devour all of the things that are closest to you and that interest you the most and make them your own. So I read and reread the Book of Daniel several times. And I think that in spirit, in some ways, it's the book that this is nearest to in the most kind of just like gestalt sense, right? But I also, one way to detoxify the risk of maybe it being too influential was that I surrounded it with so much other reading. So I saw it as part of a matrix of things that were all speaking to each other.
Was the Rosenberg case big in your family? Was it a big?
It was. I came along too late for that to be like a current matter that anyone was thinking about. But I'm sure it had been in my grandmother's life, of course.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Hi. Just coming a bit from the previous gentleman's question about names of characters and everything. It started making me think of your comic work on Omega the Unknown.
Yeah.
And how much of that came from, how much did you have to believe in the character and write it beforehand, especially coming from someone else's creation, and especially coming from there being a bit of a controversy about you writing it to begin with, the original creator not wanting you to write it, perhaps?
Yeah. It was a real, so there's a lot of references to things that people might not exactly know about in here, so I'm just going to give a little paraphrase. I wrote 10 issues of a comic book for Marvel about a character that was a pre-existing character in their pantheon, but a very, very minor one, quite forgotten, named Omega the Unknown. I know, it seems like it's, a joke, right? But who had only existed in the 1970s for 10 issues. And so I was kind of writing a reply to this lost superhero comic book. But the guy who'd written the original was still alive, and he had a history of grievances with Marvel about use of characters he'd invented. And so he turned that grievance in my direction when it was announced that I was going to write the comic book, which was really disconcerting to me, but really interesting. I mean, in retrospect, it was a really interesting test of some of my own principles about what I am frequently going on about in terms of reuse and appropriation and intertextuality in general, the dialogue that erupted around that. Eventually, I got a kind of tacit permission from him behind the scenes, although that didn't get as much air as his initial expression of grievance, partly because he was just a really feisty dude. But I was really grateful because it seemed to me, it forced me to articulate all the reasons I wanted to use his character and thought that ultimately it was okay that I was doing so.
There are two more questions, and then we'll wrap. Go ahead, sir. Briefly, if you can.
In your last three novels, there's a lot of actual history and actual events, and you've talked about that a lot today in relation to the recent one. And you've talked about gender bending, but I'm also wondering, if you think, as you obviously do, about those moments when you don't just stretch events fictionally, but characters take off and make love to Archie Bunker or start flying through the air. I'm sure it's not your intention that that's just a purely silly event. So how do you decide when a character is going to start making love to Archie Bunker or flying through the air?
I'll mention a couple of things, then I'll try to make a general reply. One of my early readers for this book was Michael Chabon, who is, ever since he did Cavalier and Clay and I wrote Fortress of Solitude, we've been sort of allied by in other people's view as having similar interests in bringing fantastical or generic genre elements into fiction, but also we feel a kind of a kinship and an interest, great curiosity about what one another is doing. And I had him read this book, and he said, well, you just did another genre that you took another discredited déclassé genre and you've put it into literary fiction, and that's fanfic. Because what this chapter really is it's a chapter of All in the Family fan fiction. But I think that at some point early on, I mean, I could never have articulated this, but it seemed to me that I was always interested in simultaneously having my books very grounded and prosaic and having them be about very identifiable emotions and the kind of the consensual world we live in and our sense of helplessness or just the condition of daily life. but that I also always wanted them to contain a layer of something of the dream life, some kind of charge or distortion, field of influence that was more uncanny, that was more uncontrollable, that was more comprised of that zone of, what you might say, wishes, lies, and dreams, or wishes and nightmares, where things are not exactly under our command, things are not all confirmable with the senses, and that one way or another, I've done that just pretty relentlessly. Like when I used Tourette syndrome in Motherless Brooklyn, some people who were very attached to the idea that I was kind of always going to write about the fantastic were actually very disappointed in that book and said, why did you stop doing the thing that we think you do? And I realized for me it was the same thing, that the neurological fantasy, the language in that book that was running amok was a fantastic element, that it was a field of distortion laid over the everyday and taking it to another place. And in this book, in a sense, I think utopianism or ideology, the idea that the world could be different, even though we can't prove that, but we're living in a grip of this yearning for it to be so, is like a fantastic element for the lives of these characters. So once I had wishfulness in the book at that level, Archie Bunker didn't seem like that great a reach. It's a sad moment for her as a character that's where she goes, but we all have those fantasies.
Last question, ma'am.
There was an article in the New York Times last week about a study that suggests that people who read literary fiction kind of enhance their ability to empathize or read emotions in other people.
Read Chekhov instead of...
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
I wondered what you thought of that idea and if you think about it while you're writing.
Well, certainly, no, I don't write to help anybody with anything. I really mean that. I mean, I just think if you let the idea that you're like, somehow have that you're in charge of like edification or correcting things or being, making the books useful in some way, it's almost like the art is dead in the water. Somehow, which is very different from saying, if you find value as a reader, I'm thrilled to hear of it. I'm not wanting to foreclose that possibility, but it's not how you go about making stories. You make them meaningful to yourself and you make them enchanting to yourself. I want to be amazed and surprised at what my story is and then have it foremost be that experience. I want to make an experience for people. I don't want to make a tool for their brains or for anything else. But I only glanced at that piece, and my totally off-the-cuff suspicion is that it's hogwash. That the range of different things that can be experienced, the reading brain is a very mysterious realm, and that there are so many things they didn't study in that study. If you just have Chekhov and the thing that you think is valueless, James Clavell or whomever you think is writing like really undernourishing prose, well, you can probably get the result you want from a study like that. But there's so many other things to read that are weird mixtures and that encounter your brain in different ways. And when I was young, I know that some of the most radical interventions that could possibly happen to my cognition happened as a result of reading things like Lad, a Dog by Albert Payson Terhune.
Wonderful.
It just
Great.
it rewrote my entire nervous system at the time. I don't know that anything, Chekhov or anything else, could do that now the way that did then.
But you're dangerously close to pulling a Gilmore here, because a journalist might say, American author says that Chekhov is rubbish.
Yes. If you need a pull quote for this evening, that's
there it is.
Go tweet that line immediately.
On behalf of our audience, Jonathan Lethem, thank you. Thank you very much.